ask them each to tell us more about themselves and the work that they do. So I'm going to start with Eloho Omame, who is the founding managing director and CEO of Endeavor in Nigeria. And after that, I have Felicia Appenteng, who is the founding chair at IE Africa Center, a center created by IE University. And last but not least, I've got Dina Sherif, who is the executive director at the Legatum Center of MIT. So I'm going to ask each and every one of these ladies to tell me more about themselves and what they do before we kick into this session. Okay, we get into this session on what is required to create and sustain structures, practices, and environments that foster entrepreneurship and effective leadership in emerging markets. Okay. So we go with Eloho.
Okay. Hi, Eniola. Thanks for having me. I hope you can hear me. If you can't hear me at any point, I may be having a little bit of a bandwidth issue. Just let me know, and I may need you to give me permission to switch off my camera. But my name is Eloho Omame. I'm the managing director of Endeavor in Nigeria. Endeavor is an entrepreneur support organization. We're a mission-oriented organization. In Nigeria today, we're supporting 17 entrepreneurs that are leading 11 high-growth, high-impact, scale-up stage companies. Those tend to be companies that have successfully gone from tech startup to Series A, Series B type stage, and they're navigating a fresh or a new inflection point in their growth journey. Globally, Endeavor is about 20 years old. We have 1,600, 1,700 or so companies in our global portfolio, and we tend to focus on emerging markets and what we call underserved ecosystems. And the idea is sort of to what extent can we create these structures that level the playing field to allow entrepreneurs to create these big global propositions that we see coming out of other ecosystems all over the world.
Great, awesome. Thank you, Eloho. Felicia, will you tell us a little bit more about what you do? Thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone. Hi, my name is Felicia Appenteng. And so at IE University, which is based in Madrid, our goal really is to foster positive change through education, through training, and through innovation. And at the Africa Center, that means that we do this by shining a light on African solutions to global challenges, which is a mix of academic content creation, events, and custom programming. Thank you.
Great, and Dina.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dina Sherif. I'm the Executive Director of the Legatum Center for Development and Entrepreneurship at MIT. It's based out of the Sloan School of Management. And the purpose of the center is to really promote entrepreneurship as a pathway to building more sustainable, inclusive markets with a focus on emerging markets and continents like Africa. I'm also a co-founder of a company based out of Egypt called Ahead of the Curve, which supports impact-driven entrepreneurship and sustainable business practice across the Middle East. And I'm a partner in a venture capital fund called DisrupTech that focuses on the fintech space within Egypt.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. So we're just going to just dive right in. And I mean, the topic of this session is entrepreneurship and leadership, making it happen. And I'd like to backtrack a little bit. I mean, we talk about entrepreneurship in Africa and why it's so important for Africa's development and why it's so crucial. And so I'd like to ask, I'll start with Dina. Why is it so crucial? And specifically, what type of entrepreneurship do you think that the continent needs to fast track development?
I think it's crucial for a number of reasons. One, jobs. Africa has the fastest growing youth demographic in the world. And without growing businesses, we won't have the jobs required to keep their lives sustainable. I think also, in terms of propelling Africa forward and keeping us competitive globally, we really need to see our private sectors expand. So when you say what kind of entrepreneurship, I would say we need innovation-led entrepreneurship, and innovation-led is different from what I would consider your traditional small and medium enterprise, your small supermarkets, your hairdressers, those are also important and are an integral part of every economy. But what we need to see is Africa to really own the technology and innovation space and use that to drive their economies forward so that we can move into the global knowledge economy and remain competitive. But I also think that that is what we need to create the jobs required to sustain our youth and to give them a better future.
Thanks, Dina. Eloho, your thoughts on this, on the type of entrepreneurship that you think the continent needs, and maybe also what you're seeing, within your ecosystem.
Sure. So I actually completely agree with Dina. I think the word that we use is, we sort of talk about high impact entrepreneurship. And, so as opposed to describing it as innovation-led entrepreneurship, but, completely spot on. So this idea that, I think it's part of the rhetoric of very many African economies, and so, often the governments, as we say things like, SMEs are the bedrock of our economy, and we've got to do this and that to support SMEs. And of course, it's important because those are people's livelihoods. But the kinds of entrepreneurship that really will shift economies and tend to shift economies and tend to be the job creators and tend to create the innovation and foster the innovation and help sort of, national economies connect to sort of a big, vibrant global economy is not SME entrepreneurship. And so we call it high impact entrepreneurship, and it has three features from our perspective. The first is really businesses that are being built with this very sort of global, regional, global, pan-national vision. But, the idea is not to have one unit or one shop, it's how do I sort of expand this across the continent, for example. The second piece for us is around entrepreneurial leadership. And so that's one of the reasons I think that this panel is quite interesting for me. It's around sort of really, entrepreneurs behind those companies being people who see their mission, perhaps through a product and through a global, distributing that globally, but understand that and see their vision as their mission rather as scaling that company, but then going back and paying it forward into their ecosystem, not through things like, and it's nothing wrong with it, but not primarily through things like then saying, how do I sort of give back at the bottom of the pyramid, but how do I then share that knowledge and mentor the next founder and invest in the next founder and help he or she also build that global proposition. And then the third element for us is around just sort of, again, sort of finding companies at inflection points and helping them navigate the inflection points that help them to scale. But fundamentally, really the same idea, sort of this sort of big visionary, innovation-driven entrepreneurship is really what we believe helps to shift economies.
Great, thank you. Felicia, would you like to add to that?
I mean, at the risk of just kind of being a part of a chorus of saying yes, so I fully agree. When we look at companies that we like to work with at the center, this is really what we find to be really key. And so for us, what that means from a point of view of kind of shaping the narrative that we have in higher education is that those types of companies that were just described are the ones that can have lessons that can be instructive for our students and also for the rest of the world as they plan their own companies and their own innovations.
Great, thank you. I want to go back to this concept that Eloho brought up, and just to maybe unpack that a little bit also, Dina, just to hear your thoughts about entrepreneurial leadership. What is your, what do you think about the concept, of entrepreneurial leadership?
I think it's a good one. So I think if you look at how ecosystems evolved in the United States, or everyone tends to look towards Silicon Valley as this place that everyone wants to replicate, which will never be replicated for varying different reasons. But the one thing that you notice if you look at booming entrepreneurial ecosystems in the US, whether that be Silicon Valley or Boulder or Boston or Austin, you'll find at the center of those ecosystems are often always very successful entrepreneurs who have stepped into this place of being an entrepreneurial leader. And what an entrepreneurial leader for me means, and how we think about it at the Legatum Center, and I'm sure even the same for Endeavor, is when you have grown your business and you've gone through that full entrepreneurial journey, it's not that you've acquired wealth and it's time to be philanthropic and to find ways to give your money back, but rather how do you take that capital and then reinvest it in entrepreneurs who are also ready to step into that journey? How do you mentor them? How do you help them move even faster than you did? But then how do you work across all the different stakeholders that are necessary to make an ecosystem work for the entrepreneurs and help these entrepreneurs thrive? You really need entrepreneurs who have made it through to guide policymakers, to work with universities, to really work with venture capitalists and explain to them what these entrepreneurs need. Entrepreneurial leaders, they play a very significant role, I think, being at the nucleus of very powerful ecosystems. And without them, I often feel that there's always something missing, right? So for me, I think that we're starting to see beginnings of that in Africa. And I think what we all need to do is to start rallying around these entrepreneurial leaders and providing them with what they need to drive these ecosystems forward. And it's for that reason that Legatum Center, for example, is launching a new fellowship program for entrepreneurs in Africa who have gone through the full entrepreneurial journey and who will be able to immerse themselves in a semester-long program with MIT that will really focus on the role that they can now be playing in building out these ecosystems more effectively.
That's good. That's good. Actually, that's a really good, I think, segue to the next question, which is around this enabling environment, this ecosystem for entrepreneurs, right? So what do they need? Dina, you mentioned what entrepreneurs need. So what does an enabling environment mean for an entrepreneur? And what are some of the key ways to achieving this? I'll start with Eloho, and then I'll ask Felicia to contribute to that.
Mm-hmm. So the way I think about sort of what the environment potentially needs to look like, and Dina actually referred to, I think, quite a bit of it alluded to quite a bit in her response earlier. I think about a bunch of access pillars. I think about capital and talent. I think about I want to say role models and mentors, and not always necessarily, I think, in some of the ways that people tend to think about those kinds of things, and I'll explain that in a second. And then I also look for networks and connectivity and nodes. So on the capital and the talent side, well, first of all, I think what tends to happen and what a lot of our research finds is that the entrepreneurs who go on to be entrepreneurial leaders, or the ones who, when they look back on those journeys, they often tell you, in emerging markets, they often tell you the capital piece was difficult. Of course, it's always hard to raise capital, but it wasn't the hardest challenge I had to navigate. The hardest challenge I had to navigate was, especially in markets like ours, where these entrepreneurs tend to not only be innovative from the product standpoint, but also tend to be really pushing the boundaries or the frontiers of the expertise and the capital and all of those things that's available in their ecosystems, is they tend to tell you that the talent pieces were harder to solve for, or the expertise and the mentorship pieces were harder to solve for. The global connectivity pieces were harder to solve for. So I think those four elements are sort of what we tend to look for in terms of thinking about that. How we tend to frame a lot of the support that we provide for our entrepreneurs as we try and help them scale their companies. On the capital side, the kinds of things that we do look like facilitating local regional pools of capital where they're available for equity, but also saying at the end of the day, this is not Silicon Valley. A lot of the global pools of capital that invest in companies that we tend to focus on, they tend to exist in certain parts of the world or certain hubs for capital. So how do we connect our entrepreneurs to those pools of capital? The great thing about capital is it often becomes self-fulfilling, right? You need a great paystack exit, for example, and suddenly it's easier for the next entrepreneur. Partly because everybody that saw a nice tidy return out of paystack is also hopefully demonstrating some of that entrepreneurial leadership, but also because the ecosystem itself has proven its ability to scale and exit companies, right? So we try and sort of help with the capital, help with the talent by working with partners like MIT and IE and recruitment organizations, et cetera, to help the entrepreneurs. And again, remember, they're at those frontiers, helping them plug the gaps with what is available within their regions and their local markets and really where they want to be in terms of their human capital. On the market side, it's also about sort of making it easier for entrepreneurs to scale faster within their home markets, but also potentially to expand into other adjacent markets as well. And then, the fourth piece is around the mentorship. That mentorship, the most important kind of mentorship from our perspective is mentorship by entrepreneurs of other entrepreneurs. The best entrepreneurial mentors are entrepreneurs who have been through that entrepreneurial journey. I think it is true. Again, we have data that supports this, that part of the issues that tend to play out in some of our own ecosystems, for reasons that are obvious, right? We're quite early in some of these journeys, is that some of the mentorship is by people who have never actually scaled a company. So sometimes it can be a bit academic, a bit theoretical. And the last thing you want is dynamics where people who perhaps have picked up a bunch of bad habits along the way are then sort of teaching those back into the ecosystem, right? So we try and sort of really, really encourage mentorship, true mentorship by people who have sort of walked that journey. But it's really those four elements from our perspective.
That's right. That's really, really great. And Felicia, what are some of the key ways to achieving this sort of enabling environment? Eloho touched on mentorship. She touched on talent and sort of partnerships and how they work with organizations like IE and MIT. So can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I mean, so I actually want to take this question from a little bit of a kind of a further back perspective, right? And so what I think is just really important when we have these types of conversations is that, there's this really kind of really damaging myth that Africa has been cut off from the rest of the world and that global innovation has happened without Africa. What we actually really know and understand is that African innovation and resources have really powered global wealth. And that's everything from techniques in rice farming that were used to build wealth here in the US, where I'm based, to learning concepts like democracy in Egypt. And so we really have to make sure that we have a system to measure innovation at a global scale that makes sense, that really makes those types of ideas visible. And then what we really need is that, in that sort of previous sort of global supply chain, I mean, Africans didn't have power in that dynamic, right? So you were getting the innovations, you were getting the ideas, but they could not fully own their role in that part of the conversation. And so I think that in order for us to have a ecosystem that truly enables, we have to be able to speak honestly about what the history has looked like previously, how it is currently playing out, to be able to have some of those things inform how we operate.
Absolutely. And
Eniola, can I just say something quickly about this idea of an enabling ecosystem, right? Because when we think of ecosystems, it's important to understand the components of an ecosystem and how integral they are to each other. So, at MIT, we say for innovation to thrive, you need to have universities who are active, you need to have policymakers who are dedicated, you need risk capital, you need entrepreneurs, and you need, and I'm missing one. It'll come back to me. But anyway, my point is that you need to say, we need to go much further back in building entrepreneurial cultures that start with education. And I think that when we talk about entrepreneurship, and specifically within the Egypt context, we always talk about the entrepreneurs that exist and who have somehow, were able to build businesses regardless and to innovate regardless or in spite of some of the poor policies or in spite of the fact that we have education systems that really don't encourage innovation. And what we need to see, I think, in Africa today, and to Felicia's point, is one, we need to really own the fact that there was a lot of innovation in our history. There certainly was a lot of innovation within Egypt's history. And I'm sure all of you can speak to your own history as well. But we need to go back and remember that at the core, we need to be teaching our youth to have entrepreneurial mindsets. And I think that is a component that is not focused on enough when it comes to building strong entrepreneurial enabling ecosystems, right?
Absolutely. I think entrepreneurial mindset is absolutely key, I think. And so so we've talked about, what we need in terms of education. We've talked about, sort of the mentorship. We've talked about capital, the capital that's needed, the support, those kinds of support systems. We haven't talked about government and policy. And so I would like to ask, all three of you, what you think the role of government and policy is in fostering entrepreneurship. And I'm sure we have a lot to say about that, in from the different countries and different perspectives. But yeah, Eloho, would you like to touch a bit on that?
No, I'd rather not start actually, because I suspect that my answer is sitting somewhere on the opposite side of the spectrum.
I can start.
Yes, please.
Because I probably know where Eloho is going to go. I think policymakers, their role is to regulate, and that should stop. It should stop it there, right? They should provide strong policy environments for businesses to thrive, with everything that encompasses, and that's where I think the role of government should stop. Then I think they need to let the private sector and others really take over from there. So, and that's what we've seen in many other places around the world, right? Governments regulate, not over-regulate, right? So there has to be a balance. And then I think I'll let Eloho take over from there.
No, we actually have different. I really
over-regulation part.
Yes, quite. So I think, I think there's a massive problem with overregulation, right? So I think when you talk about governments needing to regulate and stop at regulation, my challenge tends to be that, they tend to view that role as a bit more expansive. I don't actually think that many governments, at least not the Nigerian government, has a mindset around we have to be the nucleus of or the source of innovation in the ecosystem. I actually think we're definitely at the point of over-regulation. I see another role for government. I don't know that I'm necessarily comfortable that we are quite there yet. We're quite ready for it yet. But if you also think about some of the ecosystems that you alluded to earlier, Dina, I think there's also sometimes the government seeing itself as playing a first loss role in many ways, right? So when you speak about some of that risk capital, can I as a government take some of that first loss around risk capital? When you speak about innovation, can I as a government fund sort of the very early pieces of very early R&D that perhaps then does the work that means that that R&D leads to areas, monetizable, marketable parts of innovation that the entrepreneurs can then pick up and build products and build companies around. You see that, for example, in certain fields, for example, biotechnology, etc., where the governments have tended historically to be the ones that in the environments where there's massive research and development have tended to sort of go first, right? My fear in our context is that, again, it just becomes one more place where the government potentially overreaches. So for now, my own sort of the mantra I preach is very much in line with what Dina just said, which is, regulate and stop, get out of the way of the private sector. But I think there's some redefinition of that boundary around regulate and stop. I think we're still seeing quite a bit of regulatory overreach.
Great, thank you. Felicia, what are your thoughts on the role of government and policy?
I mean, so I mostly agree. I would say that so the examples that we oftentimes give of really great ecosystems just wouldn't have been possible without government investment in those systems. And so when you look at, a place like Silicon Valley and just sort of like if you pick those sort of like the top top 5 big innovations, those wouldn't really have been possible without without sort of direct government investment. I think that those entrepreneurs who are now tycoons don't like to frame it like that. But I think that sort of investment is oftentimes a little bit underrated. And that can look like, yes, some form of regulation to make sure that people actually have equitable access to opportunity. Otherwise, you have folks who are quite mediocre, but who are well connected that end up doing quite well, which we have too many of in countries around the world. So I think that there is a role But I think that the sort of bigger role is that we need our governments to make sure that the innovations that we produce in our countries have value and count at a global scale. I am happy to see that happening now in countries like Ivory Coast and in Ghana when it comes to cocoa. So I think that that is something that is quite promising, and that without that, then we're going to be stuck thinking that the best, chocolate in the world comes from France and from Belgium, right? So I think that government has to play that role, but there is certainly a line. So we'll see where that line is. I'm not sure.
Great, thank you. I've just been told that we have run out of time, unfortunately. Very, very short, too short, because I think there's a lot more to discuss, but just wanted to thank Dina, Eloho, and Felicia for just being here and for their contributions and their thoughts. And thank you to everyone who has been part of this conversation, has been viewing, and the next session, I believe, is kicking off now. So thank you so much. All right, then. Thank you. Bye-bye.